This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we're diving deep into a topic crucial for our modern world, one that affects our economies, our industries, and our national security: critical minerals.
It is not in our interests to walk away from the world and come home and, think that we can produce everything alone. We can't, and we shouldn't try.
These unassuming elements like aluminum, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and nickel might not be in the headlines every day, but they are the backbone of our high-tech, low-carbon future. The demand for these minerals is skyrocketing, driven by the global shift towards clean energy and electric vehicles. But here's the catch. Their supply chains are delicate, vulnerable, and often controlled by just a few nations. So, as countries race to secure their access to these precious resources, they're also engaging in a geopolitical tango, using these minerals as potential tools of influence on the world stage.
The other question on China then tends to be, is America going to catch up? Well, probably not, because China is not just standing still.
In this episode, we're joined by Morgan Bazilian and Sharon Burke to explore those influences and ask the tough questions about the future of these vital resources. Morgan Bazilian is the director of the Payne Institute and professor of public policy at the Colorado School of Mines and former lead energy specialist at the World Bank. The Honorable Sharon Burke is the founder and president of Ecospherics, who works to balance national security and environmental sustainability with a focus on ideas that scale through public policy. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020.
Morgan, I'm going to start with you, with where I like to usually start with a bit of a scene setter. Could you please describe what the current critical mineral supply chains look like? Who are the players that are involved and at what stages? And why have they become such a pivotal and strategic concern for both economic development and national security?
Thank you very much, Courtney. It's a pleasure to be with you. Honored to be on a Network 2020 with my friend, the Honorable Sharon Burke, who is marvelous on this topic. I think, your introduction covered the wider scale of the issue of critical minerals. Why are we talking about these things? How did the vocabulary become part of a wider public discussion? It is an interesting one. In the United States, my belief is that critical minerals have risen up the priority list primarily for political reasons and primarily because of the ongoing trade war with China. And it also happens to be, and we can go into this, one of the only topics that is roughly bipartisan. In other words, both parties are interested in critical minerals, partially for different reasons, but at least to an extent, both because of the so-called domination of China in this space. So what are these things? There are confusingly quite a few different lists of what a critical mineral is. The United States is not alone in having a critical minerals list. The European Union has one, Japan has one, Australia has one, Canada has one. And many and other countries and regions as well. And the methodologies to describe the term criticality varies dramatically across those different regions. So as an example, in the United States, we think of this in terms of supply side security, so to speak. And in other words, how much are we importing of these materials and chemicals versus and from where countries like Canada and Australia take an almost inverse approach. In other words, they're thinking about how these minerals contribute to their own economic development through trade. So that's the first thing to say. Now, to make this landscape a little bit more complex, the United States does have technically one critical minerals list put out by the USGS, the United States Geological Survey. That's been going on for years. We had critical minerals lists going back to 1973 and before. So it's not a new topic. But now, recently, the Department of Energy just released its own critical minerals list, which is in fact different than the USGS and uses a different methodology and has different but overlapping minerals. So even for someone who watches this space fairly closely, like I do and Sharon does, that is in fact a bit confusing. So we have these lists of what is critical. I've said that I believe that in the United States, it's high on the agenda because of politics. We're also looking at significant demand increases for some of these minerals from energy transitions, and that is primarily because of electric vehicle growth and the batteries in the electric vehicles. But it's not only that. These minerals are also used in solar panels, in wind turbine motors, etc. And so as you look forward, you can see demand growing rapidly for the energy aspects of these. So each of these minerals already exists, has markets. The energy part of those market demand is growing rapidly. The criticality list is not limited to energy. At least the USGS list is not limited to energy uses. It also includes those for national security, defense, military uses. And so there's another word called military metals, which has a different connotation, as you might imagine. And maybe I'll stop with the opening by just saying that China does, in fact, dominate this space. When we think of these minerals, it's often discussed in terms of the actual mineral or element themselves, which is a myopic way to look at this discussion. Really, it's much more useful to look across supply chains from the minerals through their refined products, which tend to be chemicals, into advanced manufacturing, into things like electric vehicles or batteries or cell phones or myriad other consumer products. And China has been working on this for decades. And so it's not a new area to them. And the reason they dominate the market is sort of complex, but at least one of them is because they realized this was going to be an important part of modern economies and modern societies decades ago. And that the other question on China then tends to be, well, is America going to catch up, or can America dominate? It's sort of the wrong question. The answer to that question is, well, probably not. And because China is not just standing still as America takes note of this area. And so they're actively investing and working on this all over the world. So hopefully I gave you, Courtney, a little bit of a paintbrush look at critical minerals, and I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you, Morgan. Sharon, turning to you, how can the U.S. strengthen its supply chain, and what are the implications of doing so outside of traditional national security? So if you're trying to make the argument of why we need to do this, I think, I mean, you can certainly go into the national security implications because I think that's important, but I think it would also be interesting to see how environmental and sustainability concerns factor in, and whether or not, if I'm going to do a multi-part question, does the need for environmental stewardship put the United States at a disadvantage in this regard when it comes to playing or trying to play catch up? Maybe we can't totally play catch up.
Okay. So now I gotta let me unpack the question a little bit. And Courtney, just jump in if you want to remind me of the full trajectory there. Minerals, it's funny because the importance of minerals to economies is nothing new. Of course, they've always been, we had the Bronze Age and the Iron Age for a reason, these have always been, important materials that economies are based on going way, way back. So in a way, it's nothing new at all. What's different now is that the current global economy, sort of the information age or the digital age economy, relies on a suite of materials. Some are very traditional, like copper, which, as Morgan, who is the real expert on this, as Morgan mentioned, that new U.S. Department of Energy list, copper is on that list, which it hasn't been on the criticality list before. And friends at USGS have told me it's not because copper is not critical. And it really worried them that it wasn't on the list, actually, because it will be. And the scale of demand over time is going to make it critical, but it isn't right now necessarily. So the digital age economy, it's everything is depending not just on these more traditional materials such as copper or aluminum, but also on a suite of new materials where the demand for them is fairly recent, at least at this scale. So gallium, germanium, cobalt, lithium. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One of the things we haven't mentioned yet is that the IT sector depends on a lot of these materials. So if you ever wondered how your tablet screen is reactive, or the way that your little cell phone can have a battery that lasts so long, this is because you've got a periodic table in these devices. And while the amount per device is not very much, the performance, everything depends on a sustainable, lasting access to these materials. So that kind of demand has skyrocketed in the last 20 years because of IT, and for other reasons. I mean, there are also major infrastructure, and medical devices also depend on these materials. Some of them are, for example, not corrosive and not reactive, meaning that if it doesn't, your skin won't have an allergic reaction to it. So the fact that we have all these medical miracles where you can implant, new joints in your body, things like that, a lot of these materials are a really important part of that story. So there's a whole suite of amazing inventions that depend on access to these materials, plus all the things that Morgan talked about with renewable energy. And then in a more narrow sense of national security, defense equipment, modern defense equipment really depends on the same cross section. Everything from metals and things like titanium, which is under pressure right now because of Russia's war on Ukraine, to more boutique rare earth elements and things like that, or other materials that are important for things like glass coatings on lasers, things like that. So it's national security in the sense that, global prosperity depends on these materials. And that's increasingly true with the modern economy. But it's also national security in that modern defense technologies specifically rely on a lot of the same materials. So as Morgan mentioned, China's had a lot of foresight in this area, particularly on these more boutique, they're not boutique anymore, but these critical minerals where there may not have been a huge demand in the past and there is now. And so China not only has developed its own industry, but also has developed the processing, because these materials, of course, don't come out of the ground in a usable state. They have to be highly processed. You have to actually get them out of the rock. Sometimes that, it depends on the purity of the ore, but sometimes that can be a real job. So you have to process them, which is, by the way, generally speaking, a very polluting process. So getting minerals out of the ground is polluting or destructive. Processing them is polluting and destructive. And then China has invested in both of those things at home, but also around the world, and has made agreements around the world to both produce and process, to mine and process these materials. And again, they were ahead of, they had foresight. You can't blame them for having foresight for where the global economy was going to go. That does mean that they have a very strong comparative advantage in a number of places. So should the United States I think in general terms, the United States has been prizing, the U.S. economy has been prizing. This is like not exactly a news flash. This everyone's been talking about this for some time now. Efficiency over resilience, and it's been very clear. Certainly, the pandemic brought this home that wasn't necessarily a good idea, and we're paying the price for that now. So that is certainly true when it comes to minerals. Is that China's been producing them, mining them and producing them more cheaply. And that has, been to the benefit of manufacturers around the world. However, now that we see that also means a very brittle supply chain, particularly when you're at odds with another country, okay, now we have a problem. So how can the United States fix that? Well, first of all, we do have some of these materials at home in the United States. We don't necessarily produce them or produce them as well as we could. There are a lot of reasons for that, including that the costs are higher here. Sometimes that's just a geological fact of life, that it's harder to get that material out. Sometimes it's because we have higher environmental standards than the Chinese do. Also land may be more expensive here. Labor may be more expensive here. There's a whole suite of reasons. Also, sometimes our permitting process, certainly on public lands, most minerals in this country are mined on private land. So, there's a lot of discussion about fixing permitting and all that on public lands, but, and there's a lot of potential there for additional recovery, but most mining is actually on private land. So, but our process for approving mining and approving refining or processing is not easy, and that certainly has constituted a barrier. So that's one thing we could do and also we don't always know there are two things we don't know enough about. One is where everything is, and so getting a better sense of where deposits are, commercially recoverable deposits. And the Inflation Reduction Act had a whole appropriation just to improve the U.S. Geological Survey's ability to scan for what's out there, which is huge. It's hard for them to get that kind of money sometimes in appropriations. So getting it is a big deal, being able to improve the mapping. And then secondarily, the other information piece that we lack on is knowing our own demand curves. So as Morgan talked about with renewable energy, the demand curves for certain materials are really going to increase, like cobalt, for example, or lithium. So having a better sense of what that demand growth looks like will allow us to manage better. The other thing is the United States, I think there's a lot of tension right now politically, certainly on Capitol Hill in the US, between people who really want to focus on increasing production at home and investing in production worldwide. And there's no question we need to do both. Why it's being brokered as a zero-sum game is ridiculous. We have to do both for all kinds of reasons, including just, geological facts underground. There are some countries that have materials that you cannot recover in the United States. But also, just strategically speaking, it is not in our interests to walk away from the world and come home and, think that we can produce everything alone. We can't, and we shouldn't try. So to me, that is just an artificial argument that we have to have one or the other. And I don't understand. The other thing is that we don't want to race to the bottom on this. What the United States and our partners, our trade partners, have to offer is that we need to be clear that this is going to be a win-win proposition, that communities and countries that engage with us in improving the supply chain for these materials are going to be able to do it on their own terms too, that they benefit, that this is not something that's going to be done to others. That's not going to be extractive in the sense of social capital, not just from the materials. So we need to be very clear on that we are going to have environmental protections. We are going to engage with communities and respect community rights. And we are going to make sure that the communities and countries that work together on this also, keep some of the supply chain at home, develop their own economies, that this becomes a win-win proposition. Right now, I think the Chinese tend to be an extractives investor. So, that is something that we have to show as a competitive advantage for the United States, but we have to be very clear on that for ourselves and what that looks like. And I do think that means also we need to do some more investing in innovation. This industry has not necessarily been cutting edge. I did talk to a gentleman in one of the mining companies once who sort of bridled at that and said, we put company money into R&D. Fair. I'm glad they do. But in general, this industry has not been super cutting edge. Again, really ironic given that what they do for a living, they cut. But, and, obviously now we don't want to substitute one super polluting energy industry for a new super polluting energy industry that just pollutes differently. So we need to figure out how to do this better with a less destructive footprint. And then the last thing I would say, which is which is a lot, is I think one thing we also have to be careful not to take off the table is demand and use, that we can't solve all of these challenges just on the supply side. Even if we were to really improve technique and we were to really invest in recycling so that we get more of a circular economy, we're still not going to be able to meet demand for these materials if we continue to need as much as we do. So we also have to figure out how to need less. So that's an end use question, and it's a societal question about the way that we live that's very consumptive. It's about innovation, all of those things. So we can't take demand off the table too and say that everything can be exactly as it is if we just substitute, cobalt for oil. I think that would be a mistake to tell ourselves that that's the truth.
Here at Global Insights, we're on a mission to bring you the most profound analysis and meaningful insights that matter. But we can't do it alone. As a nonprofit, we rely on your support to ensure we can continue providing you with the kind of content you depend on. If you value thoughtful analysis, meaningful insights, and content that makes a difference, visit network2020.org to learn how you can make an impact. Thank you for being part of the Global Insights community.
So Morgan, I think we're going to jump off a little bit here and maybe address some of what Sharon just spoke about, but I'd like to hear your opinion because you did write an article earlier this year about your thoughts on the Biden administration's recent push towards securing Made in America for critical mineral supply chain. So could you expand on that approach, whether or not you think that approach is a good step towards self-reliance, and how would you suggest that the administration handle this issue?
Thanks, Courtney. So as usual, I agree entirely with Sharon. And just to pick up that sort of her last point to expand on, Sharon and I have also both worked quite a bit in the energy sector and energy security. And for many years, for decades, the notion in the energy sector of energy independence has been very politically attractive. So we have had the current energy secretary and president both use the term energy independence as a goal. We saw the last administration use that language. We saw the administration before that use the language, etc. So it's oddly, it's sort of a bipartisan piece of vocabulary because it's so politically attractive or perceived to be politically attractive to voters. That is the idea that America can do everything on its own. And we see that manifest in different ways, whether it's physical walls or figurative walls, or in other words, on export controls or import controls and taxation, et cetera. It's always been a somewhat ridiculous idea, though. And so while it's politically attractive, it's rather nonsense as an actual goal. And that is also true in critical minerals. And so Sharon is exactly right in saying we need to think about this both from how the United States starts to reinvigorate its own mining and processing of minerals and chemicals, as well as work to strengthen the resilience of existing supply chains, that is still working with China, and diversify those supply chains, that is working with allies. And so going about it in any other way is not only suboptimal from an economic perspective, it's suboptimal from a security and resilience perspective. So, one of the first organizations that understood that very clearly was actually the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense, who knows how to fight wars and the horrible outcomes of wars, knows that you have to work with allies, and that is no different in how we should think about critical minerals supply chains. And so even the definition of criticality in the United States is almost solely, as I started by saying, and Sharon added this demand piece, the definition is only really looking at the supply side. It's how much we need, how much we import, and where we import it from. So that's the actual algorithm. But like taking cues from the energy space, we now have much more sophisticated ways to think about energy security, and some of those need to be applied here. That is, that security, or in this case, the term criticality, which can be used interchangeably in some ways, needs to consider not only demand, which Sharon said very eloquently, but also markets, institutions, and other parts of supply chains. And that's how we think of energy security now. Largely, the landscape has changed dramatically on energy security. It's now changing dramatically on critical minerals. And so if you put blinders on just on the supply side, you miss almost everything. And so do we need to reinvigorate and do more mining in the United States of these critical minerals? Yes, we do. But that alone is insufficient to create robust supply chains. And for various reasons, places like China, or specifically China, happen to be excellent at building infrastructure and building things like chemical refining plants. And that leads to the another reason why we should not try to be an island. I was at a meeting the other day, and someone actually said, it was under the Chatham House rules, so I'm just saying what they said, not who, but they said, well, no country is an island. Of course, that's totally inaccurate. Ireland and Australia are both islands, as is New Zealand. But, the point being that we're in a deeply interconnected space. And whether your colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations think of it as regional globalization or bigger globalization, in either case, we're deeply interconnected with other markets. And the more of that happens, in some cases, the better for pricing, et cetera. One of the reasons why it's so difficult in the United States to sort of go at this alone is something that's not often talked about, which is the workforce, the actual people who know how to do these things. So I am a professor at the Colorado School of Mines, which has the finest mining engineering department in the world, or one of them. And I think some of the people who actually are in that department are on this call, and they're the real experts in these minerals. But, after World War II, we largely ceded that expertise, especially in minerals refining, chemical refining, to China because of both economics and environment. So in other words, it's environmentally very difficult. So the social license to actually put these things up in the United States is difficult. China does not have that issue to the extent we do. And economically, it wasn't viable. Now it is viable, but we've lost those 70 years of workforce development. China has lots of schools and universities training people in these areas. Actually, Chile is another place that does, and we do not. The attractiveness of the industry and grappling with its history, as well as the ability of students to make likely more money going into things like data science and similar. You can see directly even at the Colorado School of Mines, where we have one of our largest majors is in applied math, statistics, data science, machine learning, AI, quantum engineering, etc. The same as any STEM university in the United States. So I think working with allies is very important. Now, we've run into a couple issues with what working with allies means, not from the DoD perspective necessarily, but from the federal perspective. If we limit who we work with to those countries where we currently have free trade agreements, we are going to miss out on some very important places. And we've already seen that with Indonesia, with Tanzania, and others for some of these critical minerals, say in the two examples I gave on nickel. So we need to use enhanced diplomatic measures to ensure that those partnerships and allies work better. The State Department is doing that. There's something called a Mineral Security Partnership. There's even something called the Energy Resource Governance Initiative that was started under the last administration and survived, to do just that, to work with countries on a diplomatic efforts on critical minerals. But let's remember that Network 2020 knows this very well, as do most of the people on this call, I imagine. But diplomacy is a long-term play, and diplomacy does not fund infrastructure in the short term. And so it's subtle and it takes time, and it does not typically relieve these sort of things in the very short term. So you have to do all of these things at once, I'm afraid.
On that note, thank you both. You are just such a wealth of information. And please, we are a nonprofit. One of the best ways to support us is through membership. We're also having a gala at the end of November, so please buy tickets. This allows us to keep these programs free and open to people around the world. And we have people joining from over 100 countries. So any support you can give is very appreciated. So with that, Sharon, Morgan, thank you so much. Thank you, Brian, for making everything happen behind the scenes, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Global Insights. If you're looking for more in-depth analysis and want to be part of our vibrant community, head over to network2020.org.